Yeah. So, Anders, you're a professor at EPFL, you're a researcher as well, and you study corals, more precisely Red Sea corals. Can, who is going to join later, works for the Swiss Foreign Affairs, and I think he works with you. Honestly, I don't get it. I don't get it. What's the link between corals and diplomacy? That's one part of what you're going to explain. But before that, I think you can explain a bit more about your studies precisely.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for all of you for being here. Welcome to EPFL. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm going to have to speak in English just to be sure I know what I say. Okay. Mais après the discussion, on peut le savoir en français. Mais I would also like to thank Tutumlu from the Foreign Ministry, justement. He's come all the way from Bern. He's been a long-term collaborator and friend on this project for many years now. On a Sunday, thank you very much. Okay. We're going to talk about corals. We're going to talk about coral reef ecosystems. And to be quite frank with you, it's not a nice story. It's a pretty serious report I'm going to give you. But it's a report with a hope, a real hope in the end, that I'm happy to say that we here at EPFL have contributed to create, in fact. So what am I talking about here? We talk about coral reefs. And this is how a coral reef should look like. The colors, the corals are beautiful, colors are fine, fish everywhere. It's an extremely rich ecosystem. Okay? We talk about the jungles of the oceans. This is very, very high level of biodiversity, and they're extremely important to many, many people, as I'll tell you shortly. The problem is that more and more frequently, and more around the world, the coral reefs look like this. The corals are dead, and because the corals are at the base of these ecosystems, when the corals die, the whole thing collapses. The whole ecosystem comes tumbling down. The fish stock is gone, etc. And it's not just a question of losing, beautiful colors and Nemo fish and all the cute stuff. The biodiversity loss is bad enough in itself. But it's very much also a question of losing what we call the ecosystem services that literally hundreds of millions of people are depending on every day from these reefs if they're healthy. For many, many people, fishing, simply food. The reefs are a direct source of what they eat, seafood. The reefs, the structures that are built by the corals, protect the coast from wave action, from erosion, from inundation. It's very important. And of course, these reefs, if they're in good shape, they are a major attractor for tourism. And there's many, many countries whose economy is primarily based on tourism, based on the reefs. So when the reefs die, we lose much more than biodiversity, which is bad in itself. Okay. Now, just to back up a little bit to tell you where these corals exist or where the reefs are, basically, they are in this belt around the equator. Okay? And the reason is that these corals, they're very sensitive to temperature. They live in a certain temperature range. They cannot tolerate too cold, and as you will see, they cannot tolerate too warm either, and that's part of the problem we're discussing here. But basically, these organisms, they cannot tolerate temperatures much below, depends a little bit where you are, but 17, 18, 19 degrees C in the coldest month. And that's why they're localized in this belt, subtropical, tropical, subtropical belt around the world. So that's one thing. The other thing that's extremely important to understand with these corals is that they are symbiotic organisms. Okay. And I think I have a pointer here, yeah. So if you look at the coral tissue, here's a little polyp, the little unit of a coral. There's two things you will see here. You see, in fact, the tissue itself of the coral is actually essentially transparent. But inside the coral lives, by the millions, in a healthy coral, tiny little dots, little algae here. There's little single-cellular algae that are symbionts that live inside the tissue of the coral. And they are absolutely critical to the functioning and the survival of this animal. It's a real true symbiosis. Why? Because these algae, they do photosynthesis. And of course, photosynthesis is, perhaps the most important biological process for life on Earth. It's what the trees and the grasses do. It's this capability by a small little enzyme called rubisco, a little miracle, with a little bit of sunlight energy from the sun, can take CO2 and turn it into sugar, which of course is a nutrient, food. And so these little algae here, they're so efficient at doing photosynthesis. They produce so much sugar that they cannot use all of it themselves, and they transfer sugar to the coral. They feed the coral to the point where they represent that transfer of sugars represents a very, very large fraction of what the coral actually needs metabolically. Now, the coral can also eat other stuff by itself. You see these little tentacles. It's like they can catch prey, small little phytoplankton, and they can stuff it into their mouth and they can eat it. But in most conditions on these reefs, this photosynthesis contribution from the algae to the coral is the major source of energy for the coral, which of course means if this breaks down, if the algae leave, the coral has a major problem. So, but because you see the tissue here is kind of transparent, what gives a coral its color is actually primarily the algae. So if you look at a marvelous big fat coral colony here in good health, most of this color here is made up, it's coming from this pigment, this chlorophyll actually that is like in the plants, in the algae, which are in there by the millions of square centimeter in this tissue. Okay. Now, if the coral is stressed by something, and one way of stressing the coral is by increasing the temperature above a certain threshold, and global warming, of course, helps with that, this symbiosis breaks down, and the algae, they leave the coral. And the result is this, c'est blanchissement, it's coral bleaching. Okay. Why? Because the algae are gone, they're left, and because the tissue is essentially transparent, what you see is the skeleton below, which you normally don't see. You see the algae or their color, but if the algae are gone, you see through the tissue, and you see the skeleton that the coral is building, which is a calcium carbonate, which is white. And that's why the coral turns white. And this is called coral bleaching. But the fact that they go white, when the algae leave, that's sort of a cosmetic problem. If you're a vein coral, you can be unhappy about that. But the real problem for the coral in this bleached state is that it's starving to death, because it no longer receives all these sugars from the algae. Okay. And so on a time scale of a few weeks, depending on where you are and depending on the conditions, the coral will simply die if this is not reversed and the algae grow back, so to speak, repopulate the tissue. And then we end up with this. The coral dies, and it's overgrown, the skeletons are overgrown by some slimy biofilm, which is no longer a coral reef, and the reef is gone. Okay. And this is, here are some of the most, sobering numbers, okay, because it's really a sort of a, not even a slow-moving catastrophe that's happening in our oceans today, happening quite fast. In the last 30 years alone, we lost now, clearly, more than 50% of what we call the pre-industrial coral reef cover. So the coral reef cover we had 150 years ago before we started messing industrially with the ecosystems. And at the rate at which we are losing these reefs at the moment, we expect that already mid-century, we will not only have much more than about 10% of these reefs left. Okay. So why are they dying? Well, of course, they're dying in many places because of local environmental stress. You can always kill corals. You can kill anything. You can, by polluting, by very destructive fishing practices, poorly managed tourism, tourists jumping all over the reefs. You should never, ever touch a coral, by the way. If you dive, don't touch them because you destroy them. Okay. But this is local. These are local environmental stress factors in principle that can be managed and alleviated locally. However, globally, there is a factor which is really efficient, unfortunately, in killing corals, and that's warming, the global warming. Because the global warming pushes the temperature up, heat waves become more and more frequent, and the temperature goes above a certain threshold, a certain tolerance level that the coral has, and the symbiosis with the algae break down, they bleach, okay? And if this bleaching is not restored, if the heat wave doesn't go away fast enough, they starve to death. And this is how it looks. This is a Great Barrier Reef on a large scale. This is from an airplane, and you can see big swath of a reef that basically turns white, and in many cases dies on a large scale. So the situation is very serious in the oceans today, okay? And as I said before, it's not just a question of the biodiversity loss, it's also very much a question of losing everything you can benefit from a healthy coral reef. So, but in this context, there was, by a small miracle, a discovery that I'm quite happy to say and proud to say that we were directly involved in making, which is there's a big hope for coral reefs, and it's in the Red Sea. Because in the Red Sea, we discovered, in particular here, in the upper part of the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aqaba here, this is the Red Sea, Gulf of Aqaba, this is the Gulf of Suez, there is a population of corals that is extremely resistant to global warming. Okay. Which gives us real hope for this long-term survival of at least one major coral reef ecosystem, and in fact, a very biodiverse reef ecosystem in that part of the world here. Now, this was discovered actually in a collaboration with a very good friend and colleague of mine, Professor Meibom, who was actually the real pioneer here, because Meibom, already about 10 years ago, was the first to realize there's something very special going on with the corals in the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay. He coined the Gulf of Aqaba a coral refuge from global warming. And then we worked together to quantify what this really means. And Meibom has built this, what he calls the Red Sea simulator. This is a big, complicated aquarium system here in which you can control just about any of the condition you want, the temperature, the pH, the alkalinity, the salinity, whatever you want, and change it in a very controlled way. So basically simulating future climate conditions on these corals. And so what we did with him was we basically started heating. We took, these are little nubbins, we call them, little coral pieces that are taken from the reefs, which are just 30 meters away. This is in Eilat, in Israel, in the Gulf of Aqaba, where this marine station is. And you begin to heat these corals. And it was absolutely shocking. We thought actually the thermometer was broken. Huh? We discovered that you can add 5 degrees on top of what these corals see during the summer. The temperature in the Gulf of Aqaba in the summer is something like 27 degrees in the water. You could go up to 32 degrees for these corals, and they still don't bleach. They're still quite happy, in fact, which is absolutely unheard of in any other place, and which gives a real hope of preservation of these corals, because no matter what, almost no matter what warming scenario we are on, for global change by the end of this century, are we going to be at 1.5 degrees, which is by now basically impossible to avoid? Is it going to be 2 degrees? Is it going to be 3 degrees? Which will in itself will create many other problems and probably kill most other coral populations around the world, unfortunately. These corals actually have the capacity to absorb, to live with that heat. Basically handing us, and I mean us, I mean the humanity, de facto a real chance of preserving a major coral reef ecosystem alive by the end of the century and beyond, if we can prevent it from destruction by local pollution in the Red Sea system. Before I say a little bit more about that, I just want to say why we think we have these special corals and how that population came to be in the Red Sea. And we think it's because about 10,000 years ago, corals repopulated the Red Sea. This was after the last ice age. We just heard about ice ages, okay? And the ice age had killed, for reasons I won't have time to go into, but the ice ages has killed all life in the Red Sea. And now we come out of the ice age into this interglacial, and the Red Sea became livable again. And so corals migrated into the Red Sea from the south. There's the only entrance, natural entrance to the Red Sea. And the corals had to pass this very, very, very warm water. There's 33, 34 degrees C in the summer. This water is very warm. They had to adapt to extremely warm temperatures. And then those who did could then send their descendants, future generations, slowly migrating up into the upper part of the Red Sea, where it's much, much colder. So today, because of this recent migration history, we believe we think this is the reason why we have a population of corals living up here who live at low temperature, 27 or so, but actually still remember in their biology how to live at 32 or 33. And that is just by chance we've been handed this unique opportunity to save a major coral reef ecosystem. Now, saving these corals will require that we reduce the local environmental stress, the local pollution in the Red Sea system itself. And here, there is one very important argument or constraint, if you want, and that is that the Red Sea is a very small body of water. It's not, I mean, there's probably a couple of 100 kilometers at the widest place here, that's all. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, which is a bathtub, they're very small bodies of water, which means that any source of pollution will spread in this system and hit all the coast, and of course not stop and show the passport on any boundary. Which means that an effort to protect these corals from the local environmental stress has to be done on a regional scale. It's not enough sort of the conventional or standard way of thinking, which is that each country by itself takes care of their own coast. A country can do fantastically in terms of protecting their own coast, managing the tourism, managing runoff, etc., onto the reef. It doesn't help them if the country in front of them or their neighbors to the side introduce pollution. So this protection of these reefs must happen on a large scale. And so if we have to limit, on a regional scale, if we have to limit the environmental perturbations, and it has to happen on a regional scale, this requires transnational collaboration, and it requires a marriage between diplomacy and science, or science and diplomacy. And of course, it's no secret to anybody that this is a geopolitically complicated region. But what we need here is, on one hand, the best possible science to underpin and inform the governments and help everybody formulate the best environmental protection strategies. And on the other hand, a diplomatic dialogue between these countries that can result in a regional scale collaboration. And out of this whole context grew the idea that perhaps Switzerland, in direct collaboration with partners in the region, could play a role. Okay. And that led to that idea led to the formation, or we call it the creation, of what we call the Transnational Red Sea Center here at EPFL, in a direct partnership with the Foreign Ministry in Switzerland. And the idea is to bridge between science and diplomacy. So, on one hand, one more time I stress this, in direct collaboration with local partners in the region, can create the best scientific basis. We can help with that, study the corals, monitoring the corals, develop new tools for doing so, and on the other hand, through our diplomacy, create the dialogue that is needed to organize, hopefully, a protection on a regional scale, which is probably the only way we can really protect these corals in the long run. Hence the presence of the Foreign Ministry in this project. It was created in March 2019 in the presence by our Foreign Minister, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, and I hand it now over to Mr. Tutumlu to say a few words about diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. It's very difficult to go on after Anders because he's such a brilliant person that it's difficult, and I will try to go on in French, so maybe it's also easier for the audience. Anders vous a expliqué très bien quels sont les enjeux concernant les coraux dans la mer, dans le golfe d'Aqaba et la mer Rouge en général. Anders, le Transnational Sea Center, qui n'existait pas encore à l'époque, en 2018, ils ont pris contact avec le département fédéral des affaires étrangères, avec nous, et nous ont raconté cette histoire des coraux. Je suis un diplomate et je ne suis pas un scientifique. J'ai des études à l'EPFL, mais aujourd'hui, je me sens plus diplomate que scientifique. Je reste toujours un ami de l'EPFL quand même. Cette histoire, pour nous, c'était très intéressante parce que ça fait plusieurs dizaines d'années qu'il y a des intérêts de la part du département, et c'est un peu aussi l'histoire de la diplomatie suisse, celle d'essayer de mettre l'évidence scientifique et les faits pour commencer le dialogue. Vous savez, les dialogues entre les politiciens ne sont pas toujours des dialogues qui sont basés seulement sur les faits. Il y a plusieurs aspects. Ici, il y a un fait, le fait c'est qu'il y a une découverte dans le golfe d'Aqaba concernant ces coraux qui résistent au changement climatique beaucoup plus que dans d'autres régions du monde. C'est aussi un fait que dans le golfe d'Aqaba, vous avez 4 pays qui sont riverains. Vous avez Israël avec une côte qui est assez petite, mais vous avez une ville qui s'appelle Eilat, qui est à un niveau touristique très intéressant, surtout pour le développement touristique d'Israël. Juste à côté, vous avez Aqaba, qui appartient à la Jordanie. La famille royale, elle a un projet très intéressant concernant cette côte d'un point de vue scientifique, mais également économique et touristique. Et après, vous avez 2 géants aux côtés de ces pays. vous avez d'un côté l'Égypte, ce sont le pays de la mer Rouge. Si vous parlez de la mer Rouge et des coraux, et vous parlez de ça avec les Égyptiens, c'est que l'Égypte. Et vis-à-vis de l'Égypte, vous avez l'Arabie Saoudite. Pourquoi la diplomatie suisse s'est mélangée de cette question? Pour moi, ça fait partie, comme pour les coraux, c'est génétique. Les coraux du golfe d'Aqaba, c'est génétique, ils se rappellent, ça veut dire cette migration dans l'eau chaude. Pour la Suisse, pour moi, c'est aussi génétique que la Suisse a toujours essayé d'amener le dialogue, a toujours essayé de mettre les faits dans les discussions à niveau politique. Pourquoi nous sommes mêlés dans ce projet? Nous sommes mêlés parce que la Suisse, elle est perçue en général aussi dans cette région comme un pays qui n'a pas d'agenda caché. Nous ne faisons pas partie de l'Union européenne, nous ne faisons pas partie de l'OTAN, nous ne faisons pas partie des grands pays qui ont des intérêts. Nous sommes perçus comme des pays qui essayent d'amener du dialogue. Donc, avec Anders, avec les autres collègues aussi, il y a aussi ici un Samuel Gardal qui a aussi fait partie de ce projet, qui est la squelette aussi de ce projet. On a essayé de se mettre autour d'une table et de voir comment essayer d'un parti de communiquer cette découverte, mais de l'autre côté aussi essayer d'amener du dialogue politique sur cela. Et l'idée qu'on a eue, c'était en 2018, c'était celle d'essayer d'organiser une conférence en Suisse sous l'égide de mon département, de mon chef de département, en invitant les pays, en invitant les ambassades concernant ce projet. Donc en 2019, on a essayé de préparer, de montrer de quoi il s'agit exactement. Anders, comme aujourd'hui, il a fait une présentation qui était plus brillante. On a essayé de créer du dialogue politique. Nous, les diplomates, moi, j'ai une carrière pour laquelle chaque 4 années, je change de place. Ça, c'est un projet qui ne va pas trouver, son plein succès jusqu'à ce que je reste à Berne. C'est un projet de long terme, comme ce sont tous les projets, à mon avis, de diplomatie scientifique. On parle de diplomatie scientifique, si on parle de diplomatie scientifique en Suisse, par exemple, ou en général, diplomatie scientifique, pensez seulement au CERN. Le CERN, c'est une réalité entre la Suisse et la France qui a réussi à maintenir le dialogue entre des superpuissances, et encore actuel aujourd'hui, si vous pensez à l'actualité, le dialogue avec des pays où le dialogue politique n'était plus possible. Donc, la réflexion que nous, on a fait dans nos départements, dans nos DFAE, c'était celle de dire on essaye de mettre ces pays qui ne sont pas forcément amis, qui ne cherchent forcément pas la coopération, qui ne cherchent pas forcément le résultat qui est en faveur de tout le monde, autour de faits, autour d'un projet pour la sauvegarde de ces coraux. Mais en effet, ce qui est aussi important, et c'est aussi les nuances qu'il faut être capable de faire, c'est qu'il ne s'agit pas seulement, et ce n'est pas le seul message, d'une question climatique, mais il s'agit également d'une question économique, d'une question sociale, d'une question touristique énorme et qui est en effet dans l'intérêt de tous les pays. Ces pays, par exemple l'Arabie Saoudite aujourd'hui, ils ont un énorme projet pour l'étude des coraux. L'Égypte aussi a de la science concernant les coraux. Israël, Anders vous a expliqué, la Jordanie également. Il y a une seule chose que chaque pays ne peut pas faire, c'est de la coopération régionale. Donc nous, la Suisse, on essaie de leur dire, écoutez, c'est très bien ce que vous faites, la science elle est excellente, mais il faut que vous coopérez, parce que si vous ne coopérez pas, il y a un risque pour toute la région. Et le risque n'est pas seulement, comme j'ai dit avant, climatique et environnemental, mais c'est aussi un risque économique énorme et social. Pensez seulement à tous les resorts en Égypte, pensez seulement à tous les projets qui sont en cours. Et pensez également à l'histoire de ce bateau plein de pétrole aux côtes du Yémen. Et pensez aux conséquences que cette pollution pourrait avoir sur toute la région. Mais encore une fois, ce n'est pas une région facile, ce n'est pas une région où on se met autour d'une table et on peut décider, c'est une région où, par exemple, si on parle, et là je suis enregistré, mais j'essaie de ne pas être trop diplomatique, si par exemple on essaie de parler avec certains pays, de dire qu'il faut coopérer avec Israël sur un tel projet, ils ne sont pas forcément contents. Mais c'est des gouttes qui font la mer, et nous on est convaincus qu'en essayant de commencer un dialogue sur une question qui est scientifique, qui est factuelle, on essaye de créer du dialogue, on essaye de faire ce que moi-même j'essaye d'appeler la diplomatie et la science pour la paix. Donc au final, de mon point de vue, c'est aussi un projet pour la paix. Ce n'est pas seulement un projet scientifique, et c'est aussi un projet diplomatique de longue haleine qu'on ne va pas certainement réussir à faire d'un jour à l'autre. Il y a beaucoup de succès, surtout grâce aux actions de Transitional Justice Center, de Anders et de tous les collègues. Et la base, c'est la coopération scientifique. Le Transitional Justice Center, Anders, ils sont en train d'enseigner aux étudiants, comme ici, dans les autres pays, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, qu'est-ce que c'est la recherche. Ils ont également découvert, et ils ont également des outils scientifiques très cutting edge qui peuvent être utilisés par les autres pays, et on essaie de les mettre à disposition des autres pays. Je pense que je vais devoir m'arrêter ici pour laisser un peu de place aux questions, et nous sommes à disposition pour les questions difficiles, c'est Anders, les questions faciles, c'est pour moi. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous deux. Alors, les micros circulent déjà. Questions en français ou en anglais, comme vous voulez. Je vois une main ici. Ah, pardon. Ce sera ici ensuite, si jamais. Je pense que c'est bon, monsieur.
1, 2, oui, c'est bon. So I'll ask in English, Anders. Actually, you've shown the gradients of temperature in the sea, one of your first pictures. I was wondering why the corals don't migrate to cooler places.
So here's this is a thermal gradient in the Red Sea. They don't migrate because they cannot. They happen. It's because everything happens too fast. It's a little bit like my colleague Jérôme Chapelès explained before. Everything is happening too fast. You know, when the corals migrated into the Red Sea 10,000 years ago, roughly, after the last ice age, they had time. Okay, so they were slowly moving into this region. Many of them were probably dying of the heat in the beginning, but over hundreds and thousands of years, they had time to slowly, you know, get used to these conditions. The corals are sessile organisms. Huh? This means that they're just sitting on a rock. Ils ne bougent pas. Huh? They don't go anywhere. They can only migrate as a population by, for example, sending out a larvae, which is transported in the water, finds another rock, most of them die, but finds another rock, settles, forms a new colony, which takes 5, 10, 15 years, depending on the species, to grow up and become sexually mature to be able to do it again. So it's a very slow migration. So in the system, right now, they are where they are. The system is bound. Huh? They cannot go any further. They are up in the top, and there's only land up there now. In other places around the world, we do see migration, some tendencies for corals to push their descendants towards colder conditions. In Japan, for example, Japan has this long coast, and there are corals that are beginning to be seen at higher latitudes where it's a little colder. This bee is pushing up. But this is simply a race against time. And I don't know who's going to win, okay? Who is going to be the hare and who is going to be the turtle, okay? But so there is migration going on. It's a very slow process. In this case, it helped to install. They had time to install in their biology to be able to, you know, the capacity to live at very warm temperatures. In most other situations, they will not be able to move fast enough.
But Anders, is there a way to estimate the pace at which they could adapt, or is it just?
There's a lot of very serious work going on now in many labs around the world where people are trying to do exactly that. They're trying to stress corals and then look at the larvae of the survivors, the next generations of the survivors, and then basically do what they call accelerated evolution. So keep pushing for the best survivors in different generations. But this work is limited by the fact that the corals take a certain amount of time to become adult and have descendants, which is 5, 10, 15 years. So in terms of research, it's a very slow process.
I have a connected question, and then I'll leave others asking questions. Could we humans actually help the process? Could we like replant coral in colder waters?
So this is great. This is a $1 million question I always get when we talk about the Red Sea. Can we take, for example, could we take the corals of the Red Sea which are resistant and plant them on the Great Barrier Reef where they're dying like flies? The answer is, technically you can move them, but in practice it's not a very good solution and almost impossible to have success with for two reasons. First of all, the corals are adapted quite strongly to their local environment. And in the Red Sea, for example, the conditions are quite special. Just one thing is quite unique there. The salinity is very high. It's very, very salty water. Why? Because it's a closed little basin, and there's a lot of evaporation. So the salinity is very high. It's much higher than out in the Pacific. So if you move the corals just for that reason alone, they are not happy where they end up. And the other thing is that the sheer scale of the problem. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, which has now been decimated over the last 10 years by almost 50%, it has a surface area bigger than Italy. So you can imagine, so in terms of manpower and cost, etc., going to plant, you cannot replant that surface area. It's simply not practically possible. And the other thing is, if you don't remove the pressure on these corals that caused them to die in the first place, you can replant as much as you want, probably. The next generations will still suffer the same fate. Okay, so the real solution here is to remove the environmental pressure. Now, if the pressure is global warming, it's difficult to remove. There's no magic bullet, as Jérôme was telling us before. But what you can do is remove the local environmental stresses on the corals, which make them more fragile and more sensitive to the warming. Okay.
Merci. We had a question right here.
On sait que le réchauffement climatique, ça augmente la quantité de CO2 dans l'atmosphère et que les océans, ils absorbent ce CO2. Mais du coup, on a vu que le CO2 était utilisé par les coraux pour faire la photosynthèse. Donc, c'est pas une bonne chose que justement il y ait plus de CO2 dans l'atmosphère pour les coraux.
Oui, so this is a very nice observation. Oui, c'est vrai. Il y a deux problèmes avec le CO2. Il y a un problème et un avantage, comme vous dites. Et les CO2 qui augmentent un peu en concentration dans l'océan, dans l'eau de mer, c'est un avantage si on veut construire un squelette de calcium carbonate. Mais c'est ce qu'ils font les coraux. Alors, ça peut accélérer, ça peut booster un peu la formation d'un squelette. Mais de l'autre côté, quand on met le CO2 dans l'océan, on baisse le pH. Ok, ça devient acidique. Ce qui n'est pas bien pour un squelette carbonaté. Okay. Alors, il y a une balance entre ces deux. Et en plus, si le pH drops, ok, je mélange un peu le mot là, les coraux doivent travailler un peu plus au niveau métabolisme pour maintenir toutes les fonctions physiologiques qu'il fait. Alors, il y a aussi ce stress au niveau métabolisme. Mais c'est un effet. Il y a un effet avec le CO2 sur le niveau de formation de squelette. Il y a aussi cet effet du pH qui drops. Ça ne va pas sauver les coraux, ça, c'est sûr. Mais en même temps, il y a beaucoup de gens qui parlent, il y a beaucoup de discussions autour de low pH, acidity problem. Ça, non plus, ce n'est pas un problème first order, premier rang pour les coraux, parce que dans les lots, là où il existe les coraux, regarde, on va éviter tout ça, ils sont là. Ça, c'est l'eau de mer qui est chaude. Okay? Et l'eau qui est chaude peut contenir moins de CO2 que l'eau qui est froide. Ça veut dire the solution, de capture, si vous voulez, par les océans de CO2 est beaucoup plus sévère vers les pôles où l'eau est froide. Ça peut contenir l'eau là-bas peut contenir beaucoup plus de CO2 qu'autour de l'équateur. Alors, le drop dans le CO2 à cause de cet effet d'augmentation de CO2 dans l'atmosphère est beaucoup plus sévère pour les écosystèmes dans l'eau froide qu'autour de l'équateur. Alors, le low pH, on peut le mesurer autour dans l'eau où se trouvent les coraux, mais ce n'est pas un problème majeur.
Merci.
Merci. D'autres questions? Oui, monsieur.
Plongeur depuis plus de 30 ans maintenant, j'ai pu commencer ma plongée sur la Grande Barrière de Corail. J'ai pu voir ce que c'était il y a 30 ans. J'y suis retourné récemment, j'ai vu ce que c'est devenu. J'ai eu la chance de plonger dans beaucoup d'endroits. J'ai vu aussi l'impact des plongeurs. J'ai plongé à Dahab. Dahab qui était une petite cité avec des tentes, 3 hôtels, rien du tout. J'ai vu ce que c'est devenu maintenant. j'ai peur, et ça, j'aimerais être assuré par vous, j'ai peur que l'impact humain désorganisé et le besoin d'amasser du tourisme fasse un effet contraire sur la mer Rouge parce que ça deviendra le dernier sanctuaire. Il y a ça. Et puis il y a aussi le fait que la mer Rouge a ce site particulier qu'elle est extrêmement profonde par rapport à d'autres endroits où il y a des récifs de corail. Est-ce qu'il y a, ça c'est la question annexe, est-ce qu'il y a un lien en cette profondeur et puis la régénération de ce corail et surtout les espèces de corail différentes qu'on voit en mer Rouge par rapport à la grande marée de corail, l'Indonésie ou je sais. Voilà.
D'abord, vous avez tout à fait raison. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous. The tourism is a sword with two. It cuts both ways. It's extremely important economically for the countries. The economy of Egypt, for example, is obviously very strongly linked to the Red Sea tourism, which is strongly linked to the reef. It's clear that there is destruction from the tourism, from the diving activities, for example. But this is something, again, that dialogue and collaboration might be able to alleviate. Okay. But this is exactly, this is kind of the aspects that we're trying to bring to the table on a regional scale. Okay. But it's very difficult to do because it requires real, what you call it, you have to enforce rules. You have to. It's not one thing is to formulate rules and regulations. It have to be actually enforced on site, and it's a big coast, etc. Now, but you are completely right. I can only agree with what you say. With respect to the depth of the Red Sea, it's an interesting point because, which is actually a disadvantage, because the Red Sea is basically a tectonic crack that's opening up tectonically. And so it's very deep. In the middle of here, in the middle of the Red Sea, it's easily a 1 kilometer depth, probably much more in certain places. And it's very steep. Okay, if you go from the coast out, it becomes deep very fast. The corals, they need light. The corals we discuss here, they need sunlight because they have these algae that do photosynthesis, and they only do photosynthesis if they have food too, they have light. Okay. So as a consequence of this, the reefs are simply clear. They are glued to the coast, very, very close to the coast. There's a few islands here where there's reefs, okay, out further depth, away from the coast, away from the human activities. But most of the reefs are very close. This means that they see all the activity of the humans. Boom, they get all the runoff, etc., right directly on them. And this is a big this is the disadvantage in terms of their protection. Okay, now. At the same time, the water in the Red Sea is very clear. You're seeing these pictures. I can't remember which way we have some pictures. Not this one. Yeah, there. Okay. The water is very clear. And this is because we have what we call oligotrophic conditions. We have very low nutrient levels in this water, which on one hand make them extremely depending on the algae, on the photosynthesis. But on the other hand, means that the sunlight can penetrate fairly deep. So we have a lot of so-called mesophotic reefs in the Red Sea, which means reefs that are down at 100, 150 meters or so, where they can still get enough sunlight to exist, but where they are a little bit protected, in some places, a little bit protected from the very warm conditions of the surface. And so there is, and we don't know how important this will be in the future, but there is a reservoir, if you want, of corals living at 100, 150 meters or so, before it becomes really dark and they can no longer live there, which may help in the process of protecting these reefs in the future. But at the same time, most of the reefs are glued to the beach and they see the pollution right on. Okay.
Thank you. Another question right in the middle.
I have a question to the diplomatic talks. Well, the countries you mentioned, all they are not necessarily all in diplomatic relationships, like Israel, Arab countries, and I don't know about Eritrea. How do they talk to each other? Do they mainly negotiate over Switzerland, and also who is talking to each other? Are the diplomats or also scientists or diplomat and scientists? Who is talking and how they are talking?
Merci beaucoup, c'est une très bonne question. Je vais répondre en français pour l'audience. On essaie de commencer avec un dialogue qui est purement scientifique. On commence essayer de créer un dialogue avec les scientifiques, avec les chercheurs, parce qu'ils ont le même intérêt, c'est l'intérêt celui d'étudier les coraux et d'étudier la résilience de ces coraux et les autres propriétés qu'ils ont. Nous, les diplomates, on a fait cette conférence en 2019. On continue à appuyer les actions de Anders et de ses collègues dans les différents pays. On essaye d'ouvrir des portes. Pour le moment, il n'y a pas un dialogue direct, au moins à notre connaissance, sur la sauvegarde de ces coraux entre ces pays. Et c'est ça que pour nous est assez malheureux et c'est ce que nous, on souhaite essayer de commencer à faire. Nous avons des dialogues politiques. La Suisse a des dialogues politiques avec l'Égypte. On a des dialogues politiques avec annuel, biannuel, avec l'Arabie Saoudite. Et on essaye d'amener cette question de la sauvegarde de ces coraux dans ces dialogues politiques. C'est un travail de longue haleine, ce n'est pas un travail où on va réussir d'un jour à l'autre. Les pays sont très différents, la coopération entre ces pays, je dirais que pour le moment, elle est au début, mais je pense que de plus en plus, il y a cette conscience de cette nécessité et c'est un travail, comme j'ai dit avant, de longue haleine.
Si je peux rebondir, ça veut dire, moi je comprends qu'il faut d'abord une équipe scientifique avec des gens qui viennent de ces différents pays, c'est ça? Pour ensuite construire un dialogue vraiment politique?
So I wanted to, because actually we're doing this, we're circumventing this, at least at the scientific level, and in very concrete terms. We have been working in Jordan with colleagues from Sudan. This was before this disaster that's going on right now. We had colleagues from Sudan up in Jordan working with us there. We've been working in Djibouti with colleagues from Sudan there. We cannot bring people from Yemen, for example, to Jordan or Israel, but the Djiboutians can. In 2-3 weeks, Samuel, correct me if I'm wrong, we have a workshop organized there in Djibouti where their colleagues from Yemen, which they have contact with, are coming and joining us. So what we're doing here, we're really, through these activities on the ground, we're creating a fabric of collaboration that didn't exist at all before. And the key point of this, it really is to build capacity building. We have here Professor Davis Tuya, who is developing a cutting-edge monitoring, computer deep learning-based monitoring tool where we can completely, he revolutionizes completely the capability to map a coral reef and recognize which state the corals are in, etc. This technology is developed by Davis. We are trained ourselves in this, we are training our colleagues locally on the ground to do this. And so, for example, in February, we were supposed to have been in Sudan for a mission. We couldn't go because of some bureaucratic circus with permits. But our colleagues in Sudan were already trained and capable of doing this work. So the data was still ensured. And so this capacity building, which can happen between partners, it doesn't have to be directly Israel this and Israel that. We can create a fabric around, and that is directly achieving two things. A, it builds capacity for monitoring and study of the corals, and B, it creates a network of collaboration that simply doesn't exist before. And based on that, we can create other levels of dialogue. And I would like to emphasize one more time, Jan is a very honest and humble man. The work that they're doing in the DFAE, the ambassadors and the teams and the team in Bern, is absolutely outstanding. It's a difficult environment, it's clear, but these ambassadors are extraordinary, and they serve Switzerland in an absolutely extraordinary way. This is we now have experienced firsthand, and in fact we come to know these people, very personally over the years, and that's why we were extremely worried for Christian Winter and his team in Khartoum. They were sitting like everybody else in the basement of their house until they finally got out last Sunday. Okay, this is the reality of Sudan. But just to say very clearly, these are the very personal collaborations and at a very high professional level of diplomacy, sometimes under very difficult conditions.
Merci. Une question au milieu et ce sera la dernière, je crois.
Okay, thank you. I think you answered my question, because I have a question about diplomacy, the diplomatic aspect of the whole thing. I'm still trying to grasp what the diplomacy efforts are about. Is it about collaboration in the scientific to advance common scientific knowledge? Or is it something that you kind of mentioned in your first presentation, in case of a crisis, in case of an environmental crisis, that there the collaboration works at that moment? What is the end goal of this diplomatic effort? Is it about the science, or is it about the, well, what is it about?
Well, I would answer that it's both ways. If you talk about science diplomacy normally, the science diplomacy, it's a concept that it's not new, but it's still a work in progress, in my opinion. If you talk about science diplomacy, you always try to talk about the three dimensions. The first one is the science for the diplomacy. The second one is the diplomacy for the science. And the third one is the science in diplomacy. In this kind of project, we have the three dimensions. So the first one, the science for diplomacy, is the fact that we are trying to create a dialogue between countries that are not friends, that are not in a good relationship, thanks to science. The second dimension when it comes to diplomacy for science is that we are trying to open doors, but not only for diplomatic purpose, but for science and for the science researchers, and that's what Anders is doing right now. It's doing in Djibouti, has done all these last years. We have also science in diplomacy. I'm a diplomat, I'm not a scientist, but I have to understand perfectly the science that is behind this project. And the science that is behind this project, it's a very important science. It's a research that can be very, very important. Nowadays in Switzerland, we talk about a fourth dimension, that it's the anticipatory science diplomacy. This is how we have future challenges. Like if you think about IA or you think about other technologies, we will have for sure challenges, but also opportunities. So when it comes to science diplomacy, we have these four dimensions. And what is the purpose of this project and all the efforts? So my humble opinion, and as a person, I really would like to see one day a cooperation among these countries on this project, a dialogue between countries to protect this special environment, that it's an environment that is important for the human being and also for the next generations. So this is, as a diplomat, this is my dream, and I would like to help Anders and all other researchers on this issue. When it comes to Switzerland in a very egoistic way, I mean, for us, it's soft diplomacy. It's a way to reinforce once again what Switzerland and what is the role of Switzerland in multilateralism. This has been always our role, to try to bring every scientific evidence, to try to bring dialogue among countries, because we are not a big player. I mean, that's an issue, and for me it's very important that we continue on this path. We do it with CERN. We have done this with CERN, but we have many, many examples where Switzerland has really tried to create the dialogue on a scientific basis.